What's up, Facebook land? Welcome to another edition of the Two Dates and a Dash podcast. I'm your host, Matt Cubbler. And before I introduce my special guest, Sid Brumbach, I want to first dedicate the show, as I always do. Today, I'm going to dedicate the show to my son. I have never done that yet. He had a really big week last week. He's, it's tough being the little brother to Rebecca, who's a phenomenal college swimmer and a record holder at her high school. And he's a sophomore at the same high school, and everybody expects him to be her. And, he had a little bit of an issue as far as did he want to swim, did he not want to swim? But he sort of figured out his own way, and he persevered. And now he's sort of made his own mark as a backstroker, which his sister was not. And last week he needed to drop about 0.4 of a second in order to get an automatic qualifying time for the districts for the high school. And in the beginning of the year, that wasn't even on the radar. And he went to a last chance meet, which is the single last meet you could possibly go to qualify. And he knocked it out of the park and qualified. So I'm very proud of him with his effort and his dedication and his willingness to figure things out and find his own path and create his own legacy. So this one's dedicated to my son, Andrew. As far as the podcast, where can you hear it? Obviously, just about anywhere. iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, Castbox, Anchor, wherever you hear podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts, you can probably find Two Dates and a Dash podcast. Now, to my guests, I'll lead off with we're friends. We've known each other for a while. Sid is an amazing guy. He's got a very diverse background. He was a Cutman, which is the guy that's in the corner of a boxer that's stopping the bleeding everywhere and putting the Vaseline on his face, but he also does the wraps on the hands before the fight, and he's just a jack of all trades. And Sid is he's cornered over 55 title fights and 907 fights, I believe, or somewhere in that ballpark of total boxing matches that he's cornered. He's also a nurse, was in the medical field, doing sales. He was a junior, phenom, world record holder for powerlifting. He's done it all. And he's also the author of a book called Unintended Consequences. So without further ado, introduce my buddy, Sid Brumbach. What's up, pal?
Hey, how you doing, Matt? Thanks for that generous introduction. And by the way, congratulations to your son. Let him know I said, good job. Excellent. So, yeah, it's been a long time. What in the world is happening to sports, to you, and everybody else out there?
Well, man, I'm first of all, I'm thankful you're on. I know you're up in Montana right now. You're having some massive lake effect snow, apparently, with 2 feet of snow out there. And I want to first tell everybody if there is some internet issues on his end with some pixelating or some delays or some audio issues, it's because he is in the middle of a massive blizzard out there in Montana. So how's everything out there in Montana?
Everything is cold, snowy, and windy. Other than that, it's a wonderful place to be. It's about 8 degrees out. It's very cold. And with the wind chills, we're at negative numbers, about 2 feet of snow on the ground. And if anybody would like to come out and do some training by running through the snow, feel free and have at it. And then in the summertime, what we can do is give you some raw hamburger in a backpack and send you back in the hills and see if you can outrun the grizzlies and the wolves.
Now, people, don't necessarily know your backstory, and I'll let people know how we met. I was managing and training a pro fighter, and who we will not name. And Sid was his cut man at times. And we did a fight, an ESPN fight out in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and Sid was cornering the fight as a cut man. And we just sort of connected and became friends and stayed friends ever since. And you're originally from the Lancaster area. You ended up moving out to Idaho several years back, and now you're in Montana. Yeah, how did you first of all, how did you decide, you know what? Shit, I'm going to move to Idaho? Because there's not many people that say that.
Well, it was pretty simple, actually. When you're in the rat race all the time, I was working for a very large multi-global, not multi-global, but multi-country, a global drug company. at some point you just say, we're done with this. My wife was done with the work that she was doing. And we realized, seeing where things were going economically, we're going to ultimately be taxed to death. We're going to be taxed into slavery, which is where we're at now. So if we're going to be poor, let's be poor in a place we want to live and where we can play, versus trying to scrape together money, go somewhere and vacation, which now we live where we vacation, and it's a whole lot easier.
So let's talk about, how you got to the point where you had the opportunity to go live where you play. So growing up in Lancaster County, take us from the early days when you decided to become a power lifter and going through that training process and how you matriculated to college and ended up in the boxing world.
So what happened is, I was a young, impressionable guy. So to play football, the only way I could play football, I was small, was to weight train. So back in the 70s, of course, not too many people weight trained. So I got into weight training then. Started to compete in powerlifting, and I was about 11 or so. Started competing in 1976, I believe it was. At that point, when I kept moving ahead, kept seeing gains, kept doing well in meets, I said, this is what I want to do for at least a couple of years before I go to college, between high school and college. So I did. And I actually, as a power lifter, I was sponsored by the Teamsters Union. Hooray, Teamsters. Thank you very much again. And they sent me with Mike and Ray Menser, who are actually bodybuilders, out in Santa Monica, California. So I lived out there for a couple of months at one point, and I trained there for nationals in 1982. I trained back in Lancaster for nationals in 81. But anyhow, that got me into the lifting world. At that point, I came back, finished my serious competitive career, and went into nursing school. And when I was in nursing school, I was working part-time at a gym. And the gym had a boxing program. And there's a wonderful amateur and pro coach in Lancaster by the name of Barry Stumpf. Outstanding coach. He's coached our national team in international competition several times. We were talking earlier about Ireland. He had actually been over there and coached against the Irish at one point in time. So they needed somebody to be on hand to help with Golden Gloves. And I was volunteered more or less by the gym that I worked at. I hated boxing. Bored the tar out of me. Boxing was like baseball. It's something you watch when you want to go to sleep. So one thing led to another, and by 1985, I worked my first pro fights down at the Silo and the rest, as they say, is history. I did my first world title fight in 1992 in Lake Tahoe with Calvin Grove and Azuma Nelson on a Don King card. Whole lot of fun there. He had a really fun corner and a pretty darn good corner too. Bobby Boogaloo Watts, who has a win over Marvin Hagler. And then there was also Augie Semeka, who was just an old-time South Philly trainer. Very knowledgeable, little excitable, but very knowledgeable. So these things left. I cut my teeth down in Philly. It was a lot of fun. Got to work with everybody from Joe Frazier down the line to anybody and anyone. It was a lot of fun.
Well, let me ask you this. So you talked about your first pro fight was in what, 1985? Did you say?
Correct. Yes.
Who was that? Who was that boxer?
You know what? Marlon Palmer. I had to think. Marlon Palmer.
Marlon Palmer was from where?
That I don't know.
Pottstown, Pennsylvania.
I would say Reading. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Pottstown. Oh my God. He was a Yingling man. Okay.
No, that's Pottsville.
So Oh, I always get that wrong. So
let me ask you, when you cornered early on in your career, and you said you didn't like boxing, it bored you. At what point in time did that shift? Did the understanding of the sport and understanding of your role in the success of your fighter, did that paradigm ever shift?
oh, that changed after about 2 years of work. Having the opportunity to work with pros. I clearly enjoyed working with the pros far better than the amateurs. The amateurs tended to be a very uh, politicized game, whereas with the professionals, it should be regimented, which for the very best fighters it was. But you didn't have, you got into the ring, you had to beat the guy. It wasn't, for the most part, we've seen some garbage decisions like Charles Brewer and Sven Otke when we were over there in Germany. I believe it was Leipzig for that fight. And Charles beat the tar out of Sven, but didn't get the decision. And then Ring Magazine called it the worst decision of the year. And he lost his belt that way. So there are some politics both ways, but it seems to be more prevalent with the amateurs.
So let's give people a little bit of an education as to what goes into being a Cutman and what it is you're looking for in between rounds on your fighter. Give us a little background into the science behind being a Cutman.
Well, before you start, you have to know a couple of things. Did your fighter maybe take a medicine he shouldn't have that will cause bleeding? Or does he have some lifestyle habits that lend him to bleeding? I had more than one fighter who had some problems with alcohol, and it causes bleeding issues. So you have to find those things out. You have to look for the scars in the face, any past cuts. Do you have a problem with swelling anywhere? So you keep an eye on those areas. The old time guys like to use new skin over those areas. I was not quite as radical about it. I did use that sometimes, but for the most part, it was just put on some Vaseline. Between rounds, what you're looking for is very simple. Swelling. And as soon as you see swelling, you got to get on it. And no, you don't rub across the area. You apply direct pressure and leave it there. So swelling's a big thing because swelling will lead to what? A cut. And of course, if you have a cut, you're looking to stop that bleeding too.
So
that's
when you thought about, when you go back and think about your career and the 900 plus fights you've cornered, is there any one, like, I know like the worst days of my job, like I've had some humdingers as a cop. What was like the top 3 humdingers that you've had, like where the guy just got the shit kicked out of him, his face was hamburger meat or whatever the case might be? Did you have any of those days?
Yeah, Darren Zenner against Dariusz Michalczewski when we were over in Hamburg for, I believe it was a WBC middleweight championship. Or yeah, it was middleweight. So we were over in Hamburg. Michalczewski, Polish. He was adopted by his newer country that he immigrated to, which was Germany. And Darren got the tar beaten out of him. He was a good fighter. He just seemed he was never the same after that fight. But he took a beating, and that is probably the one that sticks out in my mind, because what I saw was I got to see the socioeconomic implications of where somebody comes from, and also got to see from the athletic psychology side what an athlete was willing to settle for.
Explain that a little bit.
I'm saying a lot without. Well,
explain that a little bit, if you can.
Okay. So Darren came from a very poor area in Canada, Winnipeg area, actually, originally. And then he had transplanted to New York City. And for him, getting to a world championship fight, he was just happy getting into the dance. He didn't want to be the belle of the ball, though. He was, when you're satisfied with just getting there, that's not enough. You have to want to win.
And especially in a combat sport.
Yes. Yeah. And that's not to belittle him at all. I mean, a tough guy, went into the ring, but you see that he was happy that he had gotten that far in life, because I think in his mind, he never believed he would get that far, and he did. And that's a great credit to him. Good fighter.
Now let's transition a little bit. What was the biggest title fight you ever cornered?
Daryl Cooley, De La Hoya was big.
And you were in the Cooley's corner?
Yeah, and then there was the Kermit Cintron Margarito fight was pretty big. You get into, of course, Charles Brewer and the Sven Otke first fight, and then the redo. They, in my mind, were very big because I love Charles Brewer. He is one of the best fighters I've ever had the joy of working with. Charles never put on a boring fight. Charles always gave 100% in his training and always gave 100% in the ring. And he was the type of athlete that made to be better than what you were too, so that you could help him. Great guy, wonderful fighter. Really just a great fighter.
Now, what was it about him you think that made him different?
Well, everybody wants to be a champion, but very few people want to train to be a champion. Charles liked to train. And Charles had that other intrinsic factor. Some people call it an X factor, whatever you want to call it. But between his ears is where he was a champion. He was confident, he was a very good fighter, and he wanted to win. And he did everything in his power to win. And that's a joy to be around. The other guy like that was Reggie Green. Reggie Green was an awesome fighter to work with. Absolutely.
Now, Charles, with the second fight, I don't recall who won that fight on the rematch. Did he win that fight or did he lose that one as well?
He lost that one as well. Here's how it went down. The first fight he should have won when he was defending his belt. It was the IBF super middleweight championship. So he should have won that fight. He beat Aki from pillar to post. And I talked to Sven after the fight, and Sven admitted to me that, yes, I lost this fight, and I feel very sorry for Charles, but we will do it again. So the rematch, Sven Aki beat Charles, but Russell Peltz said something that was absolutely profound. You can't fight a fight to not lose. You have to fight a fight to win. And unfortunately, Charles knew that he had won the first fight, so he was fighting this fight in a little bit different stratagem in order to not lose versus to win. And Russell was absolutely right. And I'm sure if Charles had it to do over, he'd have gone out there like he did in the first fight and exerted his will on Aki.
How many times did you corner Charles?
Oh, gosh, I don't know, 12, 18, 20. I don't know, a lot. I was with when Hammer Jones, he and Hammer Jones were fighting together from back then until everything except for Charles's last fight, and I believe that was in Denmark. Last fight I was with him was over in Riesa. So
you did some traveling. Boxing brought you the world, right?
Well, it did. It certainly did. Everywhere from Australia, working with Sam Solomon, to Dominican Republic. We've gone to France, and that was with Bun Renzo against Indam for the WBA middleweight championship. That was an incredible fiasco. It was that was a situation kind of like the missed interference call with the New Orleans Saints and the Rams. Remember that?
Oh yeah,
in the
nobody's gonna
playoff.
forget that one, especially if
Okay.
you're a Saints fan.
Yeah, exactly. So we were over there in Cannes, and Giovanni knocks and Dom out. I think it was of the ring in like the third or fourth round. All the officials and everyone at the ringside helped him back into the ring. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it. I mean, there were it was a WBA belt, so you can take that for what it is.
Right.
But there was so much in the way of illegality. I mean, they literally picked him up and put him back in the ring, ended up losing the fight. But there's no way that should have been. The fight should have been over. He has to get into the ring at his own power. That was interesting. So in Cannes, it was in Hamburg a couple of times, Dortmund, Dusseldorf, Frankfurt, Cologne, Leipzig, Riesa, Berlin, Cardiff, Wales, so over in London, Cannes, Montreal a couple of times, which was fun. So yeah, everywhere with Mexico. Everywhere with Mexico. So
you mentioned earlier Kermit Cintron, who's a mutual friend of both of ours. I have nothing but respect for him. He's a great person, great man, great father, great husband. He's what, if I had to build a fighter, personal life and boxing life and meld them together, it would be Kermit Cintron. The fight that you cornered him for, I believe, had some significance, though, didn't it? And a couple years later, maybe it might have came out that maybe Margarito didn't fight fair.
No, Margarito had casts on his hands, and I don't know. He got away with it for a lot of years, and that's unfortunate that he had to cheat, because he could have really, couple of things. He could have really hurt somebody, which he did really hurt some people, but I'm talking in terms of death. And that's unfortunate, because Margarito was a talented fighter too. He didn't need to do that. He didn't need that. And he was, when you're wearing a cast and the other guy's got regular wraps on, not exactly a fair fight at all. So that was a tough fight. That was a very tough fight for Kermit. History had proven that who knows what the outcome would be if it were.
I know I've talked to Kermit personally about the fight, and he'd mentioned how it just felt different when he got hit. Mm-hmm. Like the pain level, the impact level, what it felt like. It wasn't like glove padding on your face. It was like getting hit with a brick. And it's just a shame that, because I've followed Kermit's career even before we became friends. And for a period of time there, up until those losses, he was considered pound for pound one of the best fighters on the planet. And from a guy that didn't really have a fighting background, he was a wrestler in college and started fighting late in life. And it's a shame, because I think that fight, and then the Paul Williams fight, where he tripped and fell through the ring and hit his head. And the reason I bring that fight up is because he was out of the ring, just like the fight you were talking about, except nobody helped Kermit get back into the ring. And he unfortunately lost it on the card, because they went to the cards. And I still think he was ahead on the cards, if you had to ask me.
Yeah. Unfortunate. A lot of unfortunate situations like that. It's the golden rule when you go into those fights. He who has the gold makes the rules. So whenever you get into some of those fights, you got to be a little careful. Who's the promoter? Who's the promoter's fighter? I think we're in an era of more competitive fights than I've ever seen, which is good. It's good for the fans. But you can't protect fighters no more than you could protect a football team. no more than you can protect a baseball team or any other athlete. You have to just get out there and fight the best and do it fairly. And the days of fighting 10 or 12 tomato cans and then getting your payday and then fading into the woodwork, I'm hoping they're gone. I really am. I'm hoping they're history. They seem to be. You never know.
I think obviously you've got 900 some fights under your belt and been around everyone and anyone in the business, from promoters to managers to fighters to trainers. What was the best venue you ever were in as a cut man for boxing? Because obviously you've been around the world, so you've got a lot of options to choose from.
Yeah, I'll tell you what was one of the best venues, and it was over in Cologne. Felix Sturm and Giovanni Lorenzo, they have a new arena over there, and I'm blanking on it now, but this was only about 5-6 years ago. That place was wonderful. The Bell Center in Montreal, what a great place for a fight. That place is just packed with screaming fans. Face it, there's only a limited number of things to do up in Montreal, especially in wintertime. You're either a hockey game or you might have some boxing. The other place that I found really neat when it first opened was the MGM Grand, because that was built specifically for Mike Tyson when he had gotten out of the pen. So it was in anticipation of his prison release. And I fought there with Daryl Cooley against Obakar, and that place was phenomenal at the time. Mike Tyson showed up. It was really a phenomenal place at the time. So different times, different places, some really neat places. I'm sure if I rack my brain, I could figure out another 5 or 12 that I really enjoyed.
Well, I know you did a ton in Philly, and when I had Russell Peltz on, it was like going back in time with him to the great days of Philadelphia boxing, back in all the way from how he first went to his first boxing match with his dad, and just that image of guys in suits with fedoras, smoking cigars, watching boxing. That's what I always fell in love with that, and the whole Rocky. The image of the training with Mickey in the South Philly gym and then fighting the fight at the Spectrum. If you had to pick a Philly spot that had the most meaning to you and the place that you felt the most like in all of the environment, where would that be?
Okay. Oh, the Blue Horizon. The Blue Horizon, one of the most phenomenal fights ever. And it was a first world title fight they had to run it, and it was his fighter, Charles Brewer. I want to make sure that's right. Yeah, I think it was a title fight where Charles Brewer defended his belt, and Russell can school me on this, I'm sure, against Frank Chili Rhodes out of, I believe, St. Louis. And guess who was his manager?
No
Think
clue.
about Buddy Ryan. It was right a year after. Yeah, Buddy Ryan, a year or two after he left the Eagles. And Buddy, I thought, oh God, this is going to be crazy. The Philly fans are going to go nutsy on him, and could get ugly. Man, those fans loved him. Standing ovation. Everyone wanted to meet him. It was really a neat fight. Of course, Charles took care of business and took care of business very well. But that was the Blue Horizon. A lot of good fights there. There's no place like it. The 2300 arena, which was formerly the Alhambra, is fine. Is a good place too. But the Blue Horizon has the history to it. And when you have that history, there's only one way to beat that. And that's the 2300 arena is going to have that history. And now when you have casinos all over the place, will any of these other venues be able to compete and continue to put on boxing and have that history, or will it all be lost to the money and the casinos? So that's the big question.
So I think two things on that. I agree. The Blue Rise. I only went to 2 fights there in my life, and it was just the feeling of being where people were 40 years before me, watching a boxing match in the same way. Probably the same seats. I don't know if they updated a whole lot during the times that was open. But number one, number two, when you talk about will boxing non-big arenas survive, and they'll only survive if they have a Russell Peltz in the city that they exist in. Like Russell Peltz could have easily turned into, anyone of Arum, any of those big guys, and tried to go international and put on shows at all the big places and done all that. But he stayed true to who he was and constantly promoted Philadelphia as a location to watch a fight. Granted, he did some, Atlantic City stuff, but I mean, he always made sure that he put on fights in Philly. And now I don't know if you saw or not, but they're now opening up the Met up on North Broad Street for boxing. It's an old opera house type theater, but they're having concerts now and stuff, but they're also putting on boxing matches there, which is going to be pretty cool.
I think that will be neat. That will be good. But again, when it comes down to the economics, will those smaller places be able to survive? I hope so. I really do, because I think we lose something if everything goes to a casino or a very large venue. You lose some of the way fights used to be put on. And you speak of Russell Peltz. I can't think of a better person who knows. There is no one who knows boxing better than Russell Peltz that I'm aware of. He is a boxing historian, and he's an extraordinary promoter when you consider what he has done, where he's come from, what he has done, and his longevity in a very competitive arena, no pun intended, in Philly, trying to put on fights. I mean, he has longevity, has the history. And why does he? Because he's one of the promoters out there that you absolutely can trust, because he's not going to take you over. He's not going to cheat you. He's going to be honest, straightforward with you. He's going to treat you fairly. He's a good man in boxing, and I think part of his success is because that's who he is. And he's smart, very smart guy.
I think one of the things he said during his interview was that, he would walk in, back in the day, he would walk in and tell a fighter, hey, I got a fight for you. You're fighting Joe Schmo. And the guy would be all right, and they go in and fight. He goes, now you walk in, everybody wants to protect their undefeated record, and nobody wants to go in and take a fight that could possibly challenge him. And he made the claim that, there's probably a handful of guys left in the sport that are willing to just fight. And he did mention Gabe Rosado as being one of those guys. And people may or may not like Gabe's flashy style or whatever the case might be, but no one can ever say he ran from a fight. He fought everybody, and he didn't win them all, but he fought everybody. And that's kind of what, when you look at what a Russell Peltz can do, a guy like Gabe, his career was made by saying yes to Russell Peltz. Ultimately, now granted, he's been with other promoters since then, but he's back. He's back with Russell now. But without saying yes and believing in Russell, knowing Russell's going to treat him right, he probably wouldn't have the career he had.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you look at Philadelphia, you look at the venues. It shouldn't be a surprise, considering I cut my teeth in the Blue Horizon starting, I think my first fights down there were 1986. And man, so many stories. What a crazy situation. Was there one time a guy fell over, had a heart attack right in front of us in the one corridor. I was there with Fernando Rodriguez and Barry Stump, I mentioned earlier, that coach. So he's laying there. People are just stepping over him like, yeah, well, whatever. So had to actually check on him, do CPR on him until the medics came, which was very quick. And then that was it. But it was a lot of weird stuff happened. It was a very interesting place. The history. There's no other fight town in America that will ever supplant Philadelphia as the fight town. Detroit may be close. New York, not so much anymore. It's Philly. I'm biased.
Now, if you had to pick a trainer that you cornered for the most, that you respected and that did right by their fighters, did right by the sport, who would that be?
I'd have to pick a couple. Start with Barry Stumpf out of Lancaster. He had Fernando Rodriguez, and he's made a lot of good amateur fighters who have gone elsewhere for their pro careers. They've moved either down to Puerto Rico or wherever. But he's had some good pro fighters. Fernando was his best. I think Leonard Langley with Hardcore down in Washington, D.C. That was Darryl Cooley, Ruben Bell, Reggie Green. Those were the guys. And then Ralph, who had Giovanni Lorenzo. Ralph, unfortunately, he's dead. He's dead. And he died back around 2010 or 2011. But I was actually going to leave the sport because 2010 was an unkind year to me. And he spent time on the phone talking to me so that I would not leave. And he's the only reason that I came back and worked a whole bunch of more fights since then. But he was very good to his fighters. He really was. He's from New York City. So his sons are running the gym that his father started up there.
I just love hearing people's perspective from, you see fights on TV and you see trainers and they'll do interviews or whatever. You have Danny Swift Garcia and his dad. His dad's a character, and he's all over. Anywhere there's a microphone, he's going to speak, and you don't really know who the good guys are and who the respectable guys are. And I'm always going to be a purist when it comes to the sport of boxing, just like baseball. And I know you're not necessarily the biggest baseball fan, but for me, I look at it from back when I was a kid. I had baseball cards, and I remembered I memorized every player on every team, and I knew their stats and their historical data, and when there was a trade on top of it. And it's kind of the same way with boxing and is that you've got that historical perspective of it, and you can look at boxing from an angle that most people can't.
Yeah, the one thing that I would also add, there's one other trainer, and I don't want to slight him. His name is Augie Semeka, who had Charles Brewer. Augie was a good trainer too. He was a very good trainer. He understood boxing, and Augie's 80-some years old now. So if you go back through the 80s, the 90s, he was in his prime boxing wise. 60 in his 60s he was. And he was a good trainer too. So I don't want to throw anybody out from Philly. Again, I might be a bit biased, but that's what the opinions are.
So you mentioned Oscar De La Hoya earlier on. He's one of my favorite fighters. I always thought he never backed down. He never got one of those punches. You're like, why did he stay down? Or really that was it? That's all it took. He always seemed to be a guy that would just bang with somebody. He had a lot of talent, a lot of skill. Was a very elusive fighter. What was it like to be on hand in the corner watching a fight where he was involved?
Well, it was even better because I was the guy who was in his. When you have a fight, a title fight, you have somebody from one camp goes to the other camp's corner and vice versa to watch the hands being wrapped. Now, there are officials on hand, carry over tradition. It just makes people feel better. So I was over with him, and they were using, I hate to say this, they were using the wrong size tape. They were using 2-inch tape. And they were wrapping the knuckles, or wrapping and padding knuckles. So you can't do some of those things. And they were using too much tape, and you could go on and on. So had to call them on that. So while we're waiting for the officials up there at Madison Square Garden, we were talking a bit. And apparently he was having trouble getting to the welterweight limit at 147. And saying, what can I do? We just started talking. What can I do? I mean, how do guys do this at other places? I said, well, a lot of guys will dry out. And then if they have access to it, somebody will give them an intravenous line with, there are two things you can use, just normal saline solution or something called lactated ringers, which has some electrolytes in it. And he goes, really? You can do it? I said, yeah, there's no rule against rehydrating a fighter after weigh-in. And it was just interesting that he had been on top of the game and nobody, for a long time, and nobody had said to him, hey, why don't we do this? If you're getting drained and dried out, we'll rehydrate you and life will go on and be fine. And it's not cheating. So
that's amazing that with all the money and resources and backing he had behind him, he didn't have anybody that could, give him simple medical or physiological advice.
And that is what's amazing, because when you think about the money that's involved, what the heck? Get a team together. I think Bob Arum has the right idea out there. He's got his own facility. At one time, I know he had Miguel Diaz and as Cutman. He had his own set. People bring in their own trainers. They need to do that. But he had a whole team of people. And what he needed to do was go that further step, because at that time, Oscar was still with Top Rank. And I'm not saying this is something that Bob should have known. It's something that somebody in his organization should have known and put forth, okay, we've got a doctor here, and we're going to make sure every base is covered. Nutrition, strength and conditioning, the whole 9 yards. But those things still don't happen. They're happening more here because the Europeans, that's the way they approach the game, in a very organized, methodical fashion. And consequently, they've got a lot of titles. There are a lot of titles over there that guys have lost from this side of the pond.
Well, I noticed on, when I watch TV and I watch the fights, because if I see fights on, I watch it. And, you see a lot of ones over there in Germany and in Poland and in Russia. And they're, you think they put it on a show at the MGM Grand. Over in Europe, it's a real deal, man. They put on a show, and that's packed there. And it's, the screaming lunatic fans who love boxing. And I can't say his name. The fighter I was managing before, we had an opportunity to go fight a three fight contract over in Germany, and it didn't pan out for many reasons. But one of the things I was looking forward to, had that worked out, was that environment where you get boxing fights, the big ones, the super big fights, the Mayweather fights, where everybody who's celebrities show up, and that makes it exciting. But your typical world title fight doesn't have the glitz and the glamour that you see on a Mayweather type event. But over in Europe and other countries in Eastern Europe, they every fight is of that magnitude. It's like a Mayweather every time they fight. So I wanted to be a part of that. And, I guess Canada's pretty much the same. Like you said, it's either hockey or boxing in the wintertime. I just think that if America could get back to loving boxing the way that the other countries still do, and I know MMA has really screwed things up for boxing as far as breaking up the fan base. And rightfully so. It's a great product. And I think the fact that there's one champion in one division is very important. And I think once you water it down and everybody's got a 3-letter belt around their waist, I think it limits the validation of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And what you say is true. What we have is a dilutional effect in boxing itself. You got WBA, WBC, WBO, and the IBF. Got 4 champions. Then you might have a champion in recess, and you might have a super champion. And you go on and on. So nobody knows who's really the best. Look, we know the Patriots won the Super Bowl. It's the best team in the NFL. Okay. So we have that dilutional effect just in boxing itself. And then when you step back a little bit, and you realize we have so many sports and so much sport programming on various network streaming vehicles, so that there needs to be some clarity. So I believe what you're saying, and what I definitely agree with, boxing needs to have that clarity. And we saw that clarity in past years when we were looking at Arturo Gatti, Mickey Ward. There was clarity. Those were the 3 non-championship championship fights that you can remember of the past 20, 30 years.
And obviously having had Mickey Ward on recently and walked through all 3 of those fights, I was a kid in a candy store, and you know how much I love the sport, and I respect warriors, and Arturo Gatti and Mickey Ward are 2 of the greatest boxing warriors ever. Now, Mickey may not have been the most talented boxer on the planet, but he had a lethal left hook to the body, and he was a punch receptacle that just kept coming. And Gotti was just as much a warrior, but he had much more skill, much more boxing talent. And the fact that those 3 agreed to fight each other 3 times in a row in 13 months. And that's you don't see that ever anymore. Not just 3 times in a row, but 3 fights in 13 months. Nobody does that anymore. Everybody's picking and choosing and taking time off. And I saw Thurman fought. I think it was Thurman the other day. Fought, and he had been off for like 17 months. Like, what are you doing for 17 months?
Well, he did it. In his case, I believe he had shoulder surgery. So okay. I appreciate that. Yeah. Legitimate.
Let's transition a little bit into your book. I know we spent a lot of time talking boxing, which I could do all night long with you, brother. So your book, Unintended Consequences, you wrote it a few years ago. Tell people about the book.
Well, tell you about the book is the reason it's written as fiction and nonfiction is I didn't want to get sued. The book is a fiction story. It's a suspense thriller, very techno heavy in terms of how defense systems work, how medication and pharmaceutical industry sometimes works and sometimes doesn't work for a lot of people. So what I did was I did the research, came together and based the book off of all research, all verifiable situations that currently occurred. The difficulty in doing that, it's not a problem, but it's a challenge, is as technology changes so quickly, I had to keep going back and doing rewrites here, there, and everywhere in order to make it still technologically relevant and remain accurate with it. So what it is essentially a story about a doctor who gets caught in really what is a global intrigue from a very large company where they're working in what some people would call the deep state today, what other people would call a kind of a partnership with various governments throughout the world in order to ultimately get a medication out there that might not do what it's supposed to do. And as a matter of fact, get rid of some people And why would a government want to get rid of some of those people? Because right now, if we look at the United States, we have a great overhang of debt. Officially, it's 22 trillion. Now, for every taxpayer, that's about $160,000+ for every taxpayer. How do you get rid of that debt? Well, there are a couple of ways to do it. Traditionally, most countries either try to inflate the debt away, meaning we'll print more money and your money is going to be worth less now, and also ultimately it will be worthless. So the other way is war. And there's now a third way. A third way is maybe eradicating some of those people who are part of that overhang. When you look at Social Security, Medicare, those people are taking from the system. They put in, don't get me wrong, but when you look at it through a government's eyes, they're a liability versus an asset. So what do? You get rid of some of those liabilities so you have less debt. China right now is dealing with the same problems they have what's called a 421 issue, where you have two sets of grandparents, that's your number 4, your parents, which is your number 2, and one worker to support all of those from a tax basis from when they retire. It's a Ponzi scheme. No one wants to admit it, what it is. It's a Ponzi scheme. So what I was trying to do with the book was not only incorporate some of these lessons about economics and medicine and geopolitics, put it all together in a very tightly woven, entertaining story that also educates and provokes thought. So in order to understand the book, you would have to be willing to open your mind and read and understand that this is all based on stuff that's here and now, and not just hocus pocus, made up, whatever. So,
I mean, I love the thought, the effort, the research, the time, the energy, the intellect that went into the book. I loved it. I loved it, and I'm biased. I loved it because you wrote it, first and foremost. But then I also loved it because it actually had, it made me think about a lot of things. And you think about, and I'm not, we're not going to sit here and make this a political show, but if you think about just business, and government is a business, and we are its employees on some levels, and we're definitely its assets and its liabilities. There are consumers and there are takers in every society, and to think about the fact that I have opinions on on the pharmaceutical world, and my thought process, my logic is that if we can put a remote control car on Mars and send out real time 4G picture live video from Mars, but we can't seem to fix the flu epidemic, it boggles my mind. Like, that just doesn't make any sense to me. So when I look at the hierarchy of intellect of our world, I know for a fact everything has a solution, and we've probably got them all. It's just whether or not that solution works for the moment or not, economically, geopolitically, militarily. There's got to be, there would never be death, and everybody would be strong and powerful. So there's logic to some of the reasoning that you used in there that made me go, yeah, I kind of think you're onto something there.
Well, we're at a point in America where a lot of people understand there's something wrong. When you look at average wages of the working Joe, they have increased in number, the nominal portion, but when you look at the purchasing power, they've gone nowhere since 1971. So what happened pivotally since 1971? Well, Nixon took us off the gold standard. That gave free rein to politicians to buy their votes by doing what? Going into debt for various social programs. So people have an idea there's something wrong. That's just the tip of the iceberg. What I tried to do was start to expose some of those reasons why we're where we are now. Who in their right mind really thinks that it's a great thing to shoot for 2% inflation? People say, well, 2%, it's just a number. Here's what it means. It means every $100 you have is only worth $98 in purchasing power next year. And after a decade, if it's consistent at 2%, you're about 18% down. Okay? Who thinks that's a good idea? So what does that do to the people like our parents who are savers? Well, it robs them of their money is what it does. So that's just a real simple way of looking at it. So when people, oh yeah, we want 2%. Paul Cutman, he's an egghead political shill. How he was able to get a Nobel in economics is beyond me. He's never run anything, never built anything, he's never made anything, he's never produced anything. And he's telling everybody else, this is what you should do. That doesn't work.
Dude, we could talk all day. That's a whole nother level of conversation, brother. But I love, one of the reasons I wanted you on the show was to expose the depth of who you are. Number one, I promoted you as a cut man, and people would probably think you're some, salty old guy with a toothpick in your ear or a cotton swab in your ear. But you're an author. You're a great intellect. You're a nurse. You're a businessman. You've got so much depth to who you are, and I thought it was a really cool way to share who you are with people, and hopefully get people to read your book and maybe open their eyes a little bit to some potential thoughts that maybe that they weren't thinking about.
And that's the point. That's the point. Think, and think. Because if you don't think for yourself, guaranteed somebody else is going to be thinking for you, and you may not like the consequences.
Because they would be unintended consequences. See, that we just wrapped that right up.
That's it. There you go. Absolutely. But I appreciate you. I appreciate you giving me an invite to come on and talk a little bit. It's certainly nice to catch up. Absolutely a fun time, a good hour.
Well, I'm glad you did, brother. I'm glad the internet held up for the most part. We're going to wrap up the show now. So thank you, everybody, for watching another episode of the 2 Dates in the Dash podcast. I wish I could get that out clearly. I'm your host, Matt Cubbler. My special guest today was Sid Brumbach. Thank you again for constantly paying attention to what I put out there. Hopefully I'm entertaining. Hopefully I'm bringing in some great guests to keep you thinking and keep you inspired. And for God's sakes, go out there and be kind to one another.